I'm Matt Miller from Ditch That Textbook, and I am your host, and we are super, super excited to have you here, especially for this topic and this guest. And we're going to be talking about relationships and communicating with our students. And, I really feel like it's almost become a cliche these days to talk about how relationships are the most important thing when it comes to teaching. And it's totally true. But the problem is that a lot of times we just drop it at that cliche and that's it. And we go, okay, but what can I do? If I want to have great, solid relationships and good communication with my students, what can I actually do? And the good news today is that there is a book full of all sorts of useful, practical ideas and inspiration for making this happen. And I love the red Chuck Taylors on the front of this. And we get to talk to the lady that is in the Chuck Taylors. There she is right there. It's Kim Bearden from the Ron Clark Academy. So Kim, thank you so much for being on the Ditch That Textbook Digital Summit. And can you tell everybody a little bit about who you are and what you do?
Sure. Well, thanks for having me on. I am the co-founder and executive director and a language arts teacher at the Ron Clark Academy. And if you don't know who we are a middle school in Southeast Atlanta, and we have students in grades 5th through 8th, but we also are known for being an educator training facility. So educators from all over the world actually come to this warehouse in Atlanta to sit in our classes, watch us teach, and take methods and ideas back to their classrooms. So we like to say we're trying to create a revolution in education. We've had over 50,000 educators here. And so, and I've been teaching for 32 years. This is year 32 for me. So I've been doing this for quite some time.
Yes, that is amazing. And so you mentioned, I've got to bring this up. You mentioned that it was in a warehouse, like a big, yes. It started out as an abandoned warehouse. So I've got to ask you, true or false? One day when you and Ron Clark walked into that abandoned warehouse at the very beginning, you saw a couple of shady characters in the building. Ron Clark ran for the door and you chased those guys off. True or false?
This is true. And he thought I was following him. We were in this 100-year-old factory. This area at the time was the second highest crime zone rated area in the city. And we were just determined that we wanted to show there's potential in everything and create something fantastic. And sure enough, there were some people down at the end of the hallway and they weren't supposed to be in here. So I go run and say, hey. And I'm running after them that way, and Ron's taking off out the door thinking, because we got to get away from these. It wasn't really a good judgment on my part, but to this day, it was pretty funny because he's across the street, he turns around, and I'm still in the building looking for them. So,
oh my goodness. Well, now you can say that that's legend, I suppose, which is pretty cool. So, and since
I'm the
then,
tougher one of the two of us. That's I'm known as the tougher one now.
Exactly, and for good reason, it sounds like. And so, and since then, obviously, Ron Clark Academy has become, sort of a phenomenon, and there've been so many students that have come through that have been impacted by the very things that you talk about in this book and Talk to Me. And that's really what I wanted to talk about is the importance of good, solid communication with students. And I think all of us have probably seen it in classrooms where communication is broken down, or there's a power struggle, or somebody is doing something to assert their authority on someone else, whether it be the student or the teacher. I mean, it kind of happens in all different directions. And I wondered, just sort of at the beginning here, if you could tell us about, in your own experience, the transformational effect of good communication with students and those good relationships have been.
Well, I think it's everything. I think that every day I get to visit a lot of schools, and I visit some phenomenal schools, but I also have seen many children who are just so unhappy in school, and kids who misbehave. And we all as teachers, we know this. Our job is so hard, and we know that usually when a child is misbehaving or a child is that there's more to the story. We know this instinctively. We're like, well, you know what? There could be a lot going on that we don't realize. But in the moment, sometimes because we are frustrated and we're exhausted and we're overworked and we're overwhelmed, we don't take that into consideration in our in our conversations, in the way that we interact with our students. And so it's vital. It's vital to understand that every child in our classroom has a story, and we don't always know what that story is. And so we have to keep that in mind. And the other thing is that we have to always keep, one of the principles in the book is the principle of motivation. We have got to remember, even when that child is pushing buttons, even when we're exhausted, even when we're frustrated, that our motivation has to be I want what's best for this child. I want to find solutions. I want to have a productive relationship with this child. You have to come from those places rather than a place of frustration or anger or even defensiveness or even our ego, because sometimes, our egos are hurt if we feel like a child doesn't respond to us in the way that we should. And so I think that it has been my experience, and the educators that I know that are really successful in their classrooms, that they really do a good job of developing a rapport with that child, letting children know that they feel seen, letting every child know that they are not invisible, and letting them know that even when they're being squirrely or difficult, we're going to love them through it.
Yeah, absolutely. And I thought it was so fitting in the book at the beginning of chapter 1 in your consideration chapter, you have this quote from Atticus Finch in To Kill a Mockingbird. And I think that fits with what we're talking about here. And he says, if you can learn a simple trick, Scout, you'll get along a lot better with all kinds of folks. You never really understand a person until you consider things from his point of view, until you climb inside of his skin and walk around in it. I remember that from the first time that I read To Kill a Mockingbird, and that's kind of stuck with me. So I thought that was a phenomenal example of exactly what we were talking about there, that we never know the battles that our students and that their families and that everybody, their friends and everybody that's connected to them, we don't know what they're going through. And sometimes we assume, and I think that can be really dangerous. And so to help us with that, to help us to maintain that communication and build those relationships, you have the 6 principles of effective communication that you talk about in your book. And I wondered if you could just sort of introduce us to some of the ideas in some of those principles.
Absolutely. So I think of the principles as building blocks. They're not something that have to be done sequentially. Rather, there's an ebb and a flow. Like right now, I'm hearing you, I'm speaking to you, I'm seeing things. You do them all at once. But also, I want to point out that they're extremely helpful with dealing with students, but also dealing with your coworkers, dealing with your administrators, dealing with your administrator, dealing with your teachers, dealing with parents. They really are a guide for how I interact in my daily communication across the board, even with my close friends and my family. But the first 2 are a mindset, consideration and motivation. And I think that that's vital, because I think it's never the words that you say that are as important as the sincerity with which you say them. And so this book isn't a script. It is more like guidelines for how you think, the thought process, what you go through in your mind as you're communicating with others. So consideration is that idea that you must always take into consideration that there's more to the story, things that we will never know, things that we can never understand. That doesn't mean you walk around going, I wonder what that person's issue is, and I wonder what that person's issue is. But it does help you lead with empathy. And it doesn't mean that you allow people to bully you or to mistreat you or to make excuses for bad behavior. I mean, I believe in consequences and things like that. But what it does is it tempers your approach, the way that you approach someone, your body language, your facial expression, your tone of voice, because you're taking into consideration, okay, they have a perspective that I don't necessarily have. The second principle is the principle of motivation. And that is this idea that in all of our interactions, we have motivators behind them. Sometimes they're very noble motivators, like, love and peace and understanding and insight and wisdom. Sometimes they're negative, like jealousy and anger and frustration and defensiveness. And so when you go into an interaction, especially one that might be a challenging one, if you've got those negative motivators at the forefront, it never goes as well. The third principle is appreciation. And that, of course, we know it's important to appreciate people, but it's also learning how to appreciate, even if somebody is unhappy with you, appreciating the fact that they're sharing something with you, because I'd rather someone tell me than everybody but me, right? And then we have the principle of validation, which is really digging deeper, letting people know that you see them. And then there's elements of an effective conversation, which we can talk about. And then, of course, there's the idea of celebration, that there's that importance of really telling people that I'm so glad we had this time together, that follow-up piece.
Yeah, I love that. And I love the fact that at the beginning, we've got some sort of general mindset pieces to get our brains wrapped around. And we've got some of those practical things that we can try. Some of the stuff that really resonated with me that you said was that we're trying to figure out what motivates them. And sometimes it's positive motivations and sometimes it's negative motivations. And I think that's really interesting. I'll bet that if we can find that motivation, whether it's positive or whether it's negative, we can use that to build a relationship and help the student have success. Is that safe to say?
That is safe to say. I mean, really, a lot of times misbehaviors come from negative motivators. And sometimes it's not that child's fault or that person's fault. It's because of the issues and the challenges that they are struggling with. But sometimes even we as adults, we come with, the negative motivators as well.
Mm-hmm.
And so it's really important. We have to check ourselves sometimes in the moment. We've all heard sometimes, so you have to take a deep breath. I'm very upset with you right now, but I need a moment before I come back and have a conversation with you. I think that that's healthy, because when you're speaking and spewing things in that fit of your emotions sometimes, when really what you want is solutions. You want that child to change the behavior. You want that child to improve. It shouldn't be that it comes, like a hammer. And so, I believe in guiding kids in consequences. We're a really strict school for people that don't know, but you've got to check your motivators. Another thing too, I think is important, Matt, is that I didn't even put this in the book. I realized it after I wrote the book. There's, how you write a book, this sometimes you're like, oh, I added that too. But I think that I've noticed that when you have groups of people that have unhealthy relationships, a lot of times it's because the glue that holds them together are those negative motivators. Like if you have in a school, you have a team of teachers that just gossip and complain all the time, it's because their relationship is based on the motivators of negativity, maybe jealousy, thinking other people are doing more than they're doing, that kind of thing. And so those motivators are really, really important. And I talk in the book a lot about how I don't only share things I've done well, I share things that I've done not so well. Like, I share some of my failures, right? Because for years, there have been some days that have been rough and I would redo. But, I share some stories of how when things didn't go well, it was because I was motivated by me. Like, it was all about me, like how I felt, instead of stepping outside of that and really looking at, okay, how can I interact with this person and really try to seek solutions? How can I gain insight into what that other person is thinking? That made all the difference.
Yeah. Yeah. And, something else that you said earlier, I think kind of ties really well into this too. The one thing that you said that caught my ear was that there's a difference between the words that we say and the sincerity in which we say them. Maybe not a difference. I don't know. You can clarify that. But I was wondering if we want to be able to speak with that sincerity. Do you have any ideas or suggestions for us?
Well, yeah. What I was saying is that here's the thing. You know how you've heard some people who they can say all the right words. I mean, they're smooth, they're slick talker.
Right.
You trust them as far as you can throw them.
Yeah.
That's because they're coming from the wrong motivation, right? And something in your intuition tells you. So yeah, in the book I talk about I want to be somebody that in my relationships, all of my relationships, I want to be coming from a noble place, right? A pure place, a good place, not a self-centered place. And that doesn't mean I discount myself. I actually take good care of myself and things like that. But it's that I want it to come from a place of sincerity. So I do a lot of things. I talk about doing extravagant acts of kindness in the book. Sometimes I know that the idea of random acts of kindness is a powerful one, but I believe in doing these acts of kindness, really picking out somebody and doing something extraordinary, but don't tell a soul. Like after you do it, don't put it on Instagram. Don't put it on. Look at what I did. Now, there's nothing wrong with that, but I think that if you want to really check your motivators, because if I'm going to go post every good thing I do, then am I motivated truly by helping that person, or am I motivated by trying to make sure everybody thinks that I'm fantastic? And so I just talk about sometimes I give myself a self-check by trying to really do good for others without anybody knowing what it is that I'm doing.
Mm-hmm. Yeah. Yeah. I think that's super important. And I know we've all probably seen the things where people will do something and then they'll go take a picture of it and stick it on Facebook or something. But yeah, it's really those things where people don't know that it's happening. It can be really, really pretty powerful. And then people realize, hey, they were actually doing that for me and not for themselves. Right. I love that example. That's great. You mentioned earlier, we could get into some of those elements of conversation. Yeah. And I think that could be super powerful. And I think a very practical thing that teachers could take away from all of this. So would you mind diving into some of those suggestions for having those solid conversations?
Absolutely. One of the things, if you were to come to our school and visit our classrooms, one of the things that I think most teachers will point out is being one of the most transformative things for them is the dialogue and discussion that goes on in our classrooms among our students, not just teacher-student, but among the students. And so we've really developed this culture where that's important. So there are 4 elements of effective conversation. The first one is participation. We all know from that we should make sure that every child is participating in the dialogue and the discussion, but are you really pulling in every single person? Does everyone understand that he or she has a voice? And if you have, I've had a lot of teachers say, well, what if you have that kid that wants to talk all the time? What if you have that kid that always wants to say? I mean, I think there's nothing wrong with, in a healthy way, pulling that child aside. I've done this many times in my career and say, look, sweetie, I know that you have a really good grasp of this and you have a lot of ideas. And I think your voice is important, but it's also important that you listen as much as you speak. So next time we have a conversation like this, you know what? You get 3 comments. And they'll be like, 3. And I'm like, yep, you get 3 comments. You know, do I need to have you keep track? I said, you can even put a little sticky note. And every time you get 3, because if you get 3, I bet you your 3 comments are going to be the best 3 comments you're going to have. Like they're going to be because you're going to think about it. And so if you have a kid who's monopolizing, because nobody, nobody likes that. Do something, but do it in a very, like I was very complimentary to a child. If I say it that way, like, you've got great ideas, but I want you to listen to what some of the others are. They receive it. I've never had a kid get upset about that, but I have had them in class be like, oh my goodness. Okay, this is one of my 3. Do I want to use one of my 3? Sometimes people do. They just talk so much and they never listen. And that's the second factor I put under the idea. There's 4 different elements, I think, of effective conversation. The first one is participation. The second one is hesitation. And that is really the power of hushing. The power of hush. Sometimes we're doing all the talking and we're not listening. And that's a really important thing. How that manifests itself in our classrooms. We have a protocol here that I think has been transformative in my classroom since I started to use it. And that is that students are not allowed to raise their hands while someone else is speaking. Now that is the easiest thing about it, right? But if I'm a student and my hand is in the air the entire time someone is speaking, I'm not listening. You know what I'm thinking about? What I want to say, right?
Exactly.
And teachers, y'all know that's what makes us crazy. You'll be sitting there giving instructions and the kid's got the hand raised the whole time, and then you'll call on the child and the child will ask you what you just said. It's because they didn't hear a word you said.
Yeah.
And so for us, this element of we in the education realm have been taught the importance of wait time. That's true, but also while you're waiting, is everybody truly listening? I think that's also important to point out, not only with our students, but a lot of times I think teachers have, one of the things that stresses teachers out or educators out is sometimes when you have to have contentious or challenging or just uncomfortable conversations with parents, right? And so what happens sometimes is we'll have a parent come in and sit down, and immediately we want to show that we're right, like that we had done everything we should have. We have all of our documentation, that we had followed all the procedures, that we are on. So we're motivated first of all by our ego or our fear or our defensiveness, right? So automatically we're on the defensive. And what I've learned is that, when a parent comes in, if you start with appreciation, like, thank you so much for setting up this conference. I understand you have some concerns and I would love to hear what it is that you have to say. And then you just hush. And you let that parent talk. It's amazing. Sometimes the parents, honestly, after they just have the ability just to get it out, then they're fine. I mean, it's just like they just want to be heard. So hesitation is a really powerful thing, just understanding the importance of silence and truly absorbing it. So that's the second part of conversation. And then we have clarification and information. Of course, you have to provide meaningful information, but the clarification part is important too. I think in a classroom, how that looks with my students, for example, let's say that I'm giving my students several instructions, several steps of something they have to do. I have learned it saves me time and frustration if I will say, who can explain what I just said in their own words? And I'll have a student stand up, all right, and then anybody else want to add anything to that? And they have to get up and repeat what it is I said they were supposed to do. When I first started doing this, I realized kids did not at all hear what I was saying. Now, and I was like, no. And so I think that on the get-go, just to spend a couple more moments saying, can you explain this in your own? I just explained this to you. Who can summarize this the way that you hear it? It's amazing how sometimes what we say is not what they hear. And sometimes we know that's because of vocabulary and things like that in their frame of context. But sometimes it's just that we think we're being very clear and their little minds have a lot coming at them and they don't hear it the way that we intended.
Yeah. Oh my goodness. There were so many nuggets of golden wisdom, like golden nuggets out of all of that. Oh man. One thing that you mentioned, you said, you talked about hesitation and how just the idea of hushing. And, another place where I've found that too is even not exactly in face-to-face communication conversations, but if we're teaching to an entire class, the power of hesitation can be huge too. The power of silence. I think we've got to give students a little bit of that listening white space. If we've dumped some new ideas on them, we've got to be willing to go slow and to pause every once in a while for them to process those ideas. And it makes sense to us, and we're able to flow with it and to move very quickly because it all makes perfect sense in our brains. But that's not the pace at which we should be talking, because their brains aren't working quite that fast. Is that a fair connection to make there, that it's that way in conversation, but it can be that way in instruction too?
Absolutely. We have, and if anybody's ever visited our school, that there's it's very interactive. There's a lot of movement. There's a lot of music. There's a lot of cheers. There's a lot of chants. There's a lot of energy in our classroom. But we also take into account the processing speed. And sometimes, honestly, your mind just wanders and you have to take a second to come back. And so we even have a little trick we do here, but we tell the kids this is what's really happening, in that if the kids are taught that if somebody is asked a question and they need a moment to process it, first of all, let's talk about what usually happens. Let's say I say, "Oh, Sammy, what kind of a sentence do I have here?" If Sammy doesn't answer immediately, sometimes teachers feel uncomfortable with that. And so they immediately go, "Oh, Jessica, can you help out Sammy?"
Yeah.
And so immediately what they have taught Sammy is that if he hesitates just long enough, that his voice doesn't matter, but actually he can become invisible very easily. He's not going to have to answer questions because he can just shrink back. And I want Sammy to understand, but I don't want to torment Sammy where the whole class is sitting there staring at Sammy for, 10 minutes, right?
Yeah.
So the way that we do that, one of the things because we have a lot of encouraging chants and cheers and things, but if Sammy is sitting there, you can tell that Sammy's processing it. One of our students will say something like, "You got this, Sammy," and everybody will kind of clap. And it's not to make Sammy feel nervous. It's Sammy's going, "Okay, they're fine. They know that I need a second, and they're just giving me a second to kind of get my thoughts together." I think that's important. The other thing, just as a side note, so let's say that, if Sammy still doesn't get it, as teachers, what we have to do is say, "Okay, Sammy, well, let's talk about what you do know." Now, if you remember, everybody, when we first were talking about clauses, we said that clauses were, so we bring everybody back, but then I come back to Sammy again. So Sammy, what do you think it is now? So you don't want to totally never come back to Sammy, but you don't want to sit there for 10 minutes staring at Sammy. So that whole idea of giving that child time, but sometimes giving that child time by coming back to that child. Let's talk about what we do know, kind of going back through the process again and then coming back. 99% of the time, the child then will be able to answer in some capacity and give a thought. And it lets that child know you're not invisible. You matter. I'm going to come back to you. Another thing real quick about participation, if I could say that, in the hesitation, is that if you are, I keep coming back to parent conferences because I guess in my role here, one of the biggest questions I get from educators is how to handle parents or how to have a good rapport with parents, because it's so important that we work together instead of work against each other, is that when you are in a conference with a parent, first of all, that idea of hesitation, being very, very quiet, but also let's say you have two parents that come in and one parent does all the talking. It is really vital. And I think sometimes it's the most enlightening when you have the parent who has not said a word and said, "I'm so grateful that you came in as well. Did you have anything to add? Because I just want to know what your feelings are as well." Sometimes you get the whole picture that way, quite honestly. You see, there's more to the story. Sometimes you're really able to understand all the dynamics that are in play. So that idea of, listening, but also pulling everyone in is really, really important.
Yeah, absolutely. Oh my goodness. And I was thinking back to when Sammy was struggling with that question about clauses, and you said he just needed a little bit of time to work at it. And I think of that protocol that you suggested where he said nobody can raise their hand while someone else is talking. I was thinking that's what's happened in my teaching life so much, is that as soon as you give him a second and a half to think and he doesn't respond, all of a sudden you've got all of these hands up and everybody else wants to take it, or at least the ones that you have to put on a pitch count, so to speak, with their responses in the class. Those are the ones that want to take it. And I love that, where instead we're coaching kids to encourage them and say, "Hey, you've got this," which is really cool. The other thing that I just wanted to come back to really quick was letting kids restate in their own words, which I thought was so huge. And I've seen it so many times where I'll explain something until I'm blue in the face and they just don't get it. And then one of the students will say, well, this is the way that I see it. And all of a sudden there's all these kids going, oh, that makes perfect sense. And I'm going,
yeah, it's kid speak.
Are you serious? Yeah, exactly. And so sometimes they just need to speak each other's language. And I don't think that makes us less of a teacher by letting kids say it in their own words. It's basically optimizing it for the way that their brains work. And we don't speak that language. So why not let someone else translate it, right?
Right.
Yeah.
And I also think just even it's really important just understanding kids' vocabulary development. Sometimes we think that they know things and perhaps they do, but they don't have the same group of words to express it with. I think that, you know, that's, we all know about the importance of teaching them like vocabulary that they would see on the test and things. But, you know, there was a day in my class, gosh, a couple of years ago, and we were reading an excerpt and like two different people gave me an answer that just made no sense to me. I was like, and finally, so one of my students, all of a sudden he said, Ms. Bearden, what is a hammock? And I went, hold on. I said, who in here does not know what a hammock is? Well, over half my class, because I got city kids, they don't have hammocks in the city, right? So I was like, oh, y'all don't know what a hammock is. You know, and I can't act like there's something wrong with them for that because, you know, and so I went and I Googled a picture of a hammock. I said, this, and they went, oh, that thing. Oh, okay. And then as soon as they were like, oh, that's a hammock, then they were fine. And so it was just because of their frame of context. They just didn't have the word for it. And as soon as they understood, then they completely understood the concept that I was going for.
I love that. Okay. You just mentioned earlier that a lot of times teachers come to you and ask you about interactions with parents. And you gave us a couple of ideas about using the hesitation. And if you've got two parents and one of them kind of dominates the conversation, let's shift over to them. Can we explicitly go there to the parent communication side of things? And if you've got any other suggestions or advice for working with parents?
Yes. So first of all, I think that appreciation and validation are very, very important at building your rapport with your parents. So appreciation, I alluded to this before, but let me explain more what this means. If you have a parent who is frustrated or unhappy, and by the way, I hope people don't think that I have all these unhappy, frustrated parents. I don't, because I use principles, but these are things I've learned over the years. I have very happy parents because I don't just use these principles when things are tough. I use them all the time, or we use them all the time here at our school. But the idea of appreciation, and honestly, for me, individually, this has been one of the greatest things that has transformed my ability to handle stressful situations in my role as an educator, is that I truly have learned to appreciate if someone comes to me and shares something that they're unhappy about or that they're frustrated with, because I would much rather have them come and tell me than go tell everybody else but me. Wouldn't you? Yes. You know, look, if there's any administrators listening to this, every one of them has had that phone call where a parent calls up and says, well, I've talked to all the other parents and they all agree. And you're like, why are you talking to all the other parents? Just talk to me, you know, just call me and tell me. And so I have developed, when somebody comes in, the first thing I always do, whether I set up the conference or whether they set up the conference, or even when they call me, hey, thank you for giving me a call. If something's on your heart, it's really helpful for me to know what it is so that we can come up with a solution. And I mean it. Now, you can't say that unless you have the right motivation and consideration, right? Those two mindsets come first. But I really, truly, sincerely do, even when it's something that's hard to hear, because if I don't know, I can't fix it. If I don't know, I can't be a support. And then the other thing is just this idea of validation. Parents work hard too. We work so hard. We do as educators, but many of us are parents as well. And we know, and parents work so hard too. And we have to remember that sometimes parents' emotions are blinded just because they have such unconditional love for their children. Sometimes it blinds their judgment. It happens to me as a parent too, sometimes, because you would do anything for your child. And so sometimes, you know, your judgment is blurred because of that, but parents need to hear they're good parents. And so, you know, very often I'll have a mama who's upset or frustrated or just come to me like, Ms. Bearden, I don't know what to do with this child. And they need for me to say, you're a good mama. Yeah. Right thing. I know parents need to know that if their child does something stupid or something that they, you know, does something they shouldn't do, that does not make them a bad parent. We all did stupid things as kids. I had great parents, right? I mean, every child at some point is going to make a bad choice. And I think parents wear that. They're like, oh my gosh, they're going to think I'm a bad parent, that my child would do this. And nothing could be further from the truth. And so I think saying that, expressing that to parents often, saying we're in this together. You're a good mama. I know you raised him not to do things like that. Then we come together as a team, and they realize that we see that they're working hard as well.
Yeah. Yeah. That reminds me of, in your book, there's that story of the student who ended up with detention and was supposed to come in on Saturday, and they weren't going to be able to do it. And the mom comes in, and the mom's upset. And at first it was a little confrontational. And then eventually she just needed the opportunity to be validated as like you said, you're a good mama. You are doing the best that you can for your kids. And she just kind of broke down and needed that moment to get it out, because it wasn't about you, and it wasn't about Ron. It wasn't about the school. It was about the frustration of the situation that she was in. And I think it's always been hard for me through my career to realize that frustration isn't always directed at me. And it's been sometimes very clear, it should have been very clear to me, that a parent is frustrated at the actions of the student, and that frustration comes out in the conversation. And I've had a hard time of seeing that's not about, I didn't do anything wrong. I was doing my job, and they're probably very thankful of it. But sometimes we have to realize, it goes back to what you were saying. Where is their motivation? Where is their heart in that moment? And trying to join them in that place and doing what's best for the kid.
Absolutely. And I think that, all of these principles, one thing I do want to make clear is that, this is all about, love and kindness and insight, things like that. But I'm not a pushover. Like I'm tough.
Right.
There's times to, say what needs to be said and have those difficult conversations. But because of this mindset, I will tell you that it actually, I feel like using these principles make you stronger. For example, because, if you're motivated by jealousy and anger and frustration, it weakens you, right? Because in the moment you're operating out of reflex, you're operating out of emotion. When you have these motivators like, peace and resolution and insight, and I'm calmer. And I realized that things don't hurt me as much. Early in my career, if somebody said something or somebody snapped at me, or just, I would take it so personally. I would go home, I would just wear it. I would just let it beat me down. And now I've realized, now if something is my fault, I take responsibility, but I realize that so often it has nothing to do with me. It's just that person, I am a vehicle to help them, to navigate through that challenging problem. And so I don't take things personally like I once did.
Yeah. That's super important. I love that you mentioned that. I have to stop and ask you really quick, based on what I see around, is that a car over your right shoulder?
It is. Would you like to see that? All right. So,
yes.
So this is a car that's in my room. It's a 1969 Volkswagen, and there's Catman on the top, and then I've got Batman hanging out in the back. I don't know if you can see him very well. So yeah, our school is in this old factory, and so and we've got all kinds of cool graffiti on the walls and things. It's really beautiful. And so this I found the car on Craigslist, and I sent the guy an email, and he was newly married, and it doesn't have an engine in it, and she said just give the girl the car so she can use it at her school. So it was actually good. But I had to, tow it down here, and then our artist who does all of our artwork in the building, he painted it. So, but it's a little reading nook. It's got like pillows and stuff in there, so kids can go in there, and only girls together or boys together, because I can't, the middle school can't have them parking in the class.
That is a smart rule, I think. That's great.
For being in the car, yeah, and who's in the car together. So.
Yeah. Now, since we're talking about this real quick, maybe we can take a quick detour. See what I just did there?
Yeah, it's smooth. Mm-hmm.
Yep. I know, right? But we can take a quick detour, because obviously Ron Clark Academy is known very much for creating a big experience. And you guys are known for your classroom makeovers and just for all of that. And so I wondered, for your average teacher who is, first of all, who is not average. I can't believe that just came out of my mouth. But for your just a teacher who, yes, exactly, who hasn't really done much of that before, but thinks, oh, this is cool, but I don't have the money to drop on a car or anything like that. There are definite ways that you can create those big, memorable experiences without having to go spend your entire paycheck at Hobby Lobby, right?
Absolutely. I think teachers spend way too much of their own money, and I don't think you should. I mean, honestly, we know there's teachers out there. The reality is for their kids to have pencils, they're spending it out of their own pocket. And I think
Right.
crazy. This car is here all the time. So I know that you're alluding to when we do like classroom transformations and ways to teach content. So I've been doing that. So I'm teaching for 32 years. I've been doing it for about 30. And if you do follow me on social media, I'm at Kim Bearden, but I do things very simply using resources and things that I have. As a matter of fact, for when I was in public school for many, many years, for several years, I was a single working mom, no money, no time. And I still did some of these things. So it's how do you take things that you have and use them in a different way. By the way, my book Crash Course, The Life Lessons My Students Taught Me, I talk about some of those different rooms. So that's a different kind of a book that I wrote before. But for example, I mean, just a couple weeks ago, I had my classroom changed into this, we had a football review, but I used masking tape on the floor. I borrowed jerseys from the PE department, and they had this football game. There's a video of it. If you go to my Instagram, you can scroll back a little ways and you can see there's a video explaining it. Now, I could have gone and astroturfed my whole room and had someone build me life-size goalposts and bought Falcons jerseys and dropped $600, but I use masking tape and I use the jerseys. I think it's how you use your artistry as a teacher to create the magic that's the most important. Or when I'm teaching about punctuation, I've turned my room into an Italian restaurant called Punctuationanos, but it's just old white sheets on the table and pasta, and they punctuate using pasta. Or this, I don't do that anymore because now I've shared it so much, so many people do it, and it's a fun lesson. But now I do. We did something with mechanics. Actually, you don't have to have a car, but we actually use nuts and bolts and screws to punctuate things. Or there's just lots of ways that I take sheets, sound effects. Like if you actually told your kids to bring a towel for homework, you say, just bring a towel. Don't tell them why they're going to need it because that's going to add to the mystique of it. You push your desk back. You throw a couple of towels out, have the sounds of waves crashing. Spray some ocean smelling Febreze or like some suntan lotion. And the kids come in, you say, welcome to the beach. Spread out your towel. And then you start to teach a lesson. That's magic. And so what I tell teachers is that I believe in weaving magic. And I believe that it's just the way you use your artistry as a teacher, and you use a few of those items you can find and let the imagination take place for the rest of it. So I have a lot of those examples, like I said, on social media. If you scroll down through my Instagram, they're kind of combined in there with all my family stuff too. I'm kind of to me, it's too hard to have separate accounts. So it's all merged into one big thing. So you can learn more about me that way too. But
yeah.
I have a website, a new website, kimbearden.com, where I'm starting to upload a lot of videos of those kinds of things too. It's all free, but just sharing with teachers.
That's great. And, I really feel like when people don't take the time to find that out about you and find out about other teachers like you that do this kind of thing, I think that's the stigma at the beginning is, oh, I can't do this stuff. They kind of use that dollar figure as a barrier to taking the risk and trying something. And I think if we throw that out and realize that masking tape and uniforms from the PE department or towels brought from home or any of that stuff can weave that magic, just like you said. So I think that's been the biggest encouragement to me out of that, is that you don't have to have a big budget and you don't have to have all of these specialized things and take your entire life to try to create these things. It's like you can weave a little bit of that magic in without having the Pinterest perfect classroom, right?
Exactly. I mean, there's a video that shows where my kids have this descriptive writing fashion show, but they're just wearing old mismatched clothes from old costumes. And that's all it requires. And you can put 2 rows of Christmas lights down to have the runway. Or
yes.
So I try to explain like how any teacher, because I did it when I had no resources, and how I was able to do it. So I think that's really important. I did turn my classroom for A Wrinkle in Time, I turned it into Planet Uriel, which is supposed to be kind of like Eden. But you know what? I went to a local nursery and I asked to speak to the manager and I said, can I borrow plants for 24 hours? And he said, well, how many do you want to borrow? And I said, well, as many as I can fit in that truck right there. I had a friend who works here at our school, his truck. And he said, yes. And I said, I'll put something in our Facebook, I'll tweet it. And so there's ways like that. There was the labor of that. I had to bring the plants over here, set it all up, and then bring them back the next day. But it cost me nothing. And so I think that's important too, is that there are organizations and things sometimes that are willing to let teachers borrow things and things like that. If you put it in your newsletter, put it on your Facebook page, tweet it out, say, I'll send an email to all of my parents. Now, don't go to Home Depot for that. I mean, Home Depot is great, but they don't want you doing that because they don't want teachers all over. But go to Bob at Bob's Nursery and say, hey, Bob, I want to tell my parents how you've supported my classroom. Could I borrow these particular things? And I have found that usually the answer is yes when you do it in the right way.
I love that. That's so great. Oh my goodness. There's so many things. We could just continue talking on and on and on through this. This is so great, but we've gotten some actionable tips on how to do a little bit of a classroom makeover on a budget. We've heard about how to work with parents. We've heard about how to improve our relationships with students. This is so great. I know the book Talk to Me has all sorts of actionable things in it, including I did find on page 66, there is a bit of a cheat sheet. I don't know how well people can see that, but there are the 6 principles right there where you can see some, questions and some particular words and some statements that you can actually start using immediately. Love this book. This is great. So you mentioned earlier, you've got a website at kimbearden.com and you're on Instagram. Is there anything else Kim related where if we want to get more, if we want to get in contact or see more about what you're sharing, is there anything else to share with us?
Well, I do put a lot of things on Twitter, and also the Ron Clark Academy, if you're interested in learning more about our educator training program. So if you go to ronclarkacademy.com, and there's a big old button there, you can click this as educator training, and you can learn how you could visit our schools, sit in our classrooms, watch our methods and techniques, take them back to your classroom as well. That's what makes us unique, is that that we know of, it's the only kind of professional development where we're actually observing lots of different teachers teaching in addition to the workshop training that we provide. And so you can go there. There's a fee for that, but that's actually how our school is funded. Our students attend on scholarship here, and we have students here of all different academic backgrounds. About a third of our kids came here struggling, a third were in the middle, a third were doing well. So we have classrooms that are reflective academically of all different levels, just like most teachers do. So you can learn about that at ronclarkacademy.com, and encourage you to do that if you want to learn more about us, or follow any of the Ron Clark Academy social media posts as well.
That's great. Oh my goodness. There's so much stuff out there. I mean, just all of those resources that you're sharing. Really appreciate that, and appreciate this discussion. There's been a lot of things that I think we can start using immediately right here. So Kim, this has been great. Thank you so much for your time.
Thank you, Matt.